Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello, welcome again to the course Elements of Literature and Creative Communication. We are in the 5th week and we have been discussing Indian English poetry. Well, there is a view that in response to our agonizing cry for meaning, all that the world gives as a kind of a response is deafening silence. There is a deafening silence of the world in response to the piercing cry of meaning, So probably this is where poetry comes in and tries to offer some kind of a solace. Herein we can ask the question, why do most poets write? Or you can say, how do you distinguish a good poem from not so good a poem? Well, of course, we must understand that there is also a theory, right, that basically poetry involves a word play, it's a playing of words. Well, that's not entirely true. Though there is a word play involved, that's just the structure of it. Unless you know how to add soul into those word plays, you will not be converting your play of words into extraordinary poetry. I have reason to recall all these things because we are going to discuss one of the exemplary poets of Indian English poetry, Kamala, one of the most intense poets. And while discussing her poetry, we need to know what distinguishes her poetry from the poetry of the rest of the people. In fact, her poetry emerges as very intense, because, well, she tears out a part of her flesh and adds it to the word she writes. And unless that happens, well, it does not become great poetry. In order for us to elevate our wordplay into great poetry, we must be willing to tear a part of our flesh, metaphorically speaking, remember, figuratively speaking. We must be willing to tear a part of our flesh. We must be willing to, fragment our soul and be able to join it with the words. Unless that happens, we can't create great poetry. So probably that's why Kamala Das is one of the greatest poets today, because she could accomplish that, So most of the times, when she felt deserted, when she felt desolate, when she felt let down, she went back to words time and again, and therefore she considered word more as her companion, more as her soul companion. That's why there is a lot of power in her poetry, there is a lot of intensity, there is a lot of emotion in her poetry, and most of the times when you read, you feel she is writing about yourself. Because of course, we have an interesting poem where she talks of how a poem is not a poem unless the reader feels that the poem is his piece or her piece. It's something that the reader should have written, and instead we have someone else writing it. Unless the reader feels connected in this way, well, it does not become great poetry. Well, that's true of great literature too. Okay. So before we discuss further and before we delve deeper into her poetry, let's quickly recall what we did in the previous class. In the previous class, we began with the second phase in Indian English poetry, beginning with Nizam Ezekiel, right? and then we moved on to discussing Arun Kolatkar's poetry and the Bombay Circle of Poetry, and how in the 60s or from 60s through 80s Bombay acted as a literary capital, attracting talent from various parts of India, and how it became a kind of a literary plexus or a literary node, that went on attracting artists from different parts of the globe and even different parts of India. So that's that's when we introduced Arun Kolatkar and his poetic genius. We discussed Kala Goda poems, we discussed Sarpasatra, and of course we discussed Jejuri, and how Jejuri transforms the mindscape of the literary mindscape of Bhakti tradition altogether in a new direction, and how through Jejuri a new lineage of Indian English literature begins and all that. So in this class we are going to take up another major poet, probably as important as Arun Kolatkar, but whose mode of expression, whose literary techniques and whose outlook towards poetry was different. Okay, of course each poet is different. So we have an equally significant poet in Kamala Das. That's why in fact the tagline, you can see the tagline, a fierce poet who revolutionized Indian English poetry. Here is a brief snippet of her life, of course in the form of an interesting collage. Of course figuratively speaking, all our lives are one huge collage, so this might as well depict the collage that she had as life. She was born Kamala in 1934, and right at a young age she was drawn towards poetry. It is said that she composed her first poem when she was 12, when she was hardly 12 years. So maybe class 6 or class 7 girl, imagine being glued to the world of words, experimenting with it, and eventually finding a kind of a companion in the words. So everything happened very early in the life of Kamala Das, you could say, because she married quite early. She married Madhav Das at the age of 15, Of course the relationship itself was one roller coaster ride, while of course it had a lot of ebbs and flows. Initially she began writing her works under the pseudonym Madhavi Kutti, and of course later she began writing under her own name Kamala Das. Interestingly, she was a bilingual poet like Arun Kolatkar, Vilas Sarang and other poets we discussed in the previous class. She too was a bilingual poet. In fact, it is said that Indians are basically multilinguals. It's there as part of their blood, because India itself is again a linguistic plexus. Therefore, it is in all our blood that we are bilinguals, at least bilinguals or multilinguals. So in her case, she stretched that capacity a little deeper, and she began practicing. She began writing both in Malayalam and English, and her contribution to Malayalam literature is as good as her contribution to English literature, we can say that. In one of her poems, she famously declared that I am an Indian born in Malabar, I speak 3 languages, write in 2 and dream in 1. Now, well, the poem may appear reductivistic, but it's definitely far from that. Now, look at what happens. Irrespective of how many languages you write in, but what operates behind those languages is one dream, right? It's your personality. So your personality finds an expression in different languages, So when one of the interviewers asks her how is it that she is able to write so fluently and so meticulously in both the languages, she seems to have given a kind of a classic response. She seemed to have said, when I write in Malayalam, I forget that I know English, and when I write in English, I forget that I know Malayalam, something like that. You need to efface a part of your identity in order to express yourself completely in another identity. That's when you will be able to write equally intensely in both the languages, because it's something like when you close one nostril, the other nostril has to take the volume of air, double the volume of air. So something like that. So when you close your one nostril, let's say Malayalam, then of course the English nostril has to double up its function, and it's the other way around as well. Probably that's why we find her poetry, her literature expressing intensely in both the languages. And her life itself was again one big roller coaster ride. She, all of a sudden at the age of 65, Kamala Das embraced Islam and assumed the name Kamala Suraya. Well, the reason that she felt was she felt trapped in the kind of society she lived in the kind of religion she lived in. She felt trapped, and she even gave a kind of a controversial statement that she feels liberated in Islam. And of course, that created a lot of controversy and all that, but she was unfazed. She almost turned a blind eye towards all those clamor and assumed a new identity with full vigor. She adopted a couple of Muslim kids and all that. She did it full-fledged way, and whatever she did, she did it in a full-fledged way. Earlier, if you recall, in one of our early classes, we said immortality has a different meaning. Immortality is not to live forever. Well, that's one of the misconceptions we have, or one of the popular conceptions we have about immortality. That means to live forever. No, immortality means to live every moment of our life as intensely as if that's the last moment. To live each and every moment of our life as intensely as it's the last moment. So in that sense, Kamala Das is immortal. Like her poetry is immortal, she too is immortal, because she chose to live her life with total devotion, and she lived in the moment. She lived in that moment. So in that sense, recall the poem we discussed in the previous class, The Butterfly, which is it's pinned to no past, and it it just hinges around itself. Her life and her works, it hinged around the present. So it's a kind of a poetics of the present. Her works can be called poetry of the present. And again, she died in 2009, leaving behind a very impressive collection of poems, short stories, memoir, and other remarkable features. So this is in a nutshell her life for us. Before we delve deeper into her works, of course, let's quickly get a taste of what she wrote, and of course this should give us an idea about intensity, the intensity with which she wrote. Now again, these are excerpts from some of her well-known poems. I am sinner, I am saint, I am the beloved and the betrayed. I have no joys that are not yours, no aches which are not yours. I too call myself I. I too call myself I. Remember, such an extraordinary, and look at, of course, you have already learnt different figures of speech, different poetic devices. Now look at how in this particular excerpt she goes on playing the opposites, an antithesis, right? Sinner, saint, beloved, betrayed, joys, aches. It's a kind of a play on the word, play on the binaries. It's a play on the binary, but of course it's not just a play. It's a play in a metaphysical sense, like you call it, the Leela. right? Like that, it's a kind of a verbal leela, you can call it, you know. So, like all of us are, because when a person realizes that, you know, before one passes on judgment about others, one realizes, when one realizes that you know, one also has a lot of shady background, that's when, you know, one avoids passing on judgment. So, when you realize that, you know, before branding others as sinners, when you realize that a part of you has also sinned, so therefore you have no right to pass on the judgment. Of course, you can recall the famous you know, story, Jesus, you know, the parable where Jesus you know, says, when a mob is throwing pelting stones at a woman thinking that she is a sinner, Jesus goes forward and, you know, stands himself before that furious mob and says, well, of course, those of you who feel that you haven't sinned at all in your life, please pick your stone and throw at me first. That's when the mob realizes that everybody has sinned, therefore they have no right to castigate others. So you can hear the distant echoes of that parable, you know. And this is precisely what I was saying, you know. Why is her poetry relevant to all of us? Because in her poetry, we find shades of our own joys, shades of our own, you know, aches, shades of us. That's why most of the times you might as well feel, you wish, you know, we wish we had written these lines, because, you know, to that extent you can own her lines. And when does that happen? When one goes deep down within oneself, that's where one realizes that, you know, deep down, it's only externally that, you know, you find differences between human beings, you know. Well, somebody wearing you know, kumkum, somebody wearing not wearing kumkum, somebody wearing, you know, a particular style of clothes, somebody in a different style of clothes, or the skin color, or you know, the shape of the nose, the thickness of the eyebrows, all these things. I mean, these external, I mean, the differences are there in the external features, whereas when you go deep down, that's when you realize all of us are one, all the entire world is one. Of course, this is where, as the great Upanishads say, the Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, right? This is precisely what poetry makes you realize. Deep down, all of us are one, the entire world is a family, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, you know, the entire globe is one single family, and poetry is capable of making us realize it, not making us understand it, because understanding has a temporal value. In fact, it's very fleeting. Well, your mind may understand it and you may fail to realize it. Realization is a deeper understanding. Poetry has the capacity to create that kind of a deeper understanding, all right. Like other women writers of my class, I am expected to tame my talent to suit the comfort of my family. Probably it's an excerpt from her, you know, autobiography, some kind of extraordinary or controversial statements where she almost bears the kind of, you know, depressing conditions in which she had to live. She lived throughout her life and things like that. And it's true that she was much ahead of her time, and therefore, you know, even when she chose to write as honestly as she felt, she was not appreciated. On the other hand, her poetry was branded as you know, populist, or you know, deliberately seeking controversies and all that. But of course, she did not bother with any of that criticism, because like a true poet who is only true to one's self, you know, and oblivious to the criticism of the world, one has to be true to oneself. That's when one becomes honest, you know, not when playing to the gallery. So here is a list of her important works. You know, her first poetry collection, major collection, comes out in 65. Again, you know, you can think of the Bombay Circle, the second phase of Indian English poetry, 1950s to 80s. We identified that already, you know. The second collection comes out in 67, The Descendants, The Old Playhouse and Other Houses, The Strange Time, and again in 84 her collected works comes out, you know. And apart from poetry, of course, her contribution to poetry is significant, but her contribution to, you know, even the form of autobiography is also quite immense. Life writing, we call it life writing. So, she takes her life writing to a different level, So, she is honest to the core, and even when she was honest to the core, much to the discomfort of a hypocrite society around her, she again chose to ignore and then continue to write whatever she felt like writing, whatever she felt was honest. Well, she also has many novels to her credit, and short stories. As I said, she also wrote in Malayalam, and later of course she wrote Padmavati, the Harlot, and other stories. You can see the boldness of the theme is quite evident in the title itself, a doll for the child prostitute. Her works also explore the agony of the other gender, so called the other gender, the ignored gender, and tries to give vent to their anxieties, their suppressed feelings, and all that. In other words, literature tries to reinvent through the language of her poetry. Literature itself tries to reinvent its shade, you can say. Her autobiography, My Story, was first, it's a very bold and daring kind of a work where she bears everything to its, whatever the minimum stage is there. So, originally it was called Ente Katha in Malayalam. It came out in 1972. A few years later, she published its English translation. And of course, posthumously, The Kept Woman and Other Stories was published, in fact, including her translations of short stories from Malayalam and all that. So, this is a brief aura of Kamala Das. Yeah, so I was saying that her works, be they poetry, novel, memoir, or stories in Malayalam, whatever they are, they deal with the concept of womanhood, spirituality, sexuality, language, feminism, gender. You find these concepts finding riveting creative turns in her works. Yeah, of course, here it's a Google Doodle. In fact, Google celebrated her significance of her autobiography, by creating a doodle for her, and it's been more than 10 years since she breathed last, but to this day she continues to be an enigma, and she intrigues us through her writing. Anybody who is drawn to her writing is felt mesmerized, and they find a need to go back to it. And this is the kind of response, when some people criticize, when she comes to know that people are criticizing her for exposing her own life, marital life, discards the kind of sexual exploitation she felt, so when people criticize, this is how she responded. Now, this is an extraordinary insight. It offers an extraordinary insight into understanding her mind, into understanding her writing as well. Some people told me that writing an autobiography like this with absolute honesty, keeping nothing to oneself, is like doing a striptease. True, maybe. I will firstly strip myself of clothes and ornaments. Then I intend to peel off this light brown skin and shatter my bones. At last, I hope you will be able to see my homeless, orphan, intensely beautiful soul deep within the bone, deep down under, beneath even the marrow, in a fourth dimension. The society that saw that she bared her personal life could not go beyond a few scenes in her autobiography. They did not go beyond probably they just saw that it's true she bared herself, but probably many people just all that they saw in that act of bearing was physical bearing, nuding herself out. But what she said, no, I went further. A sensitive reader would see how she goes on peeling not just her clothes, her body, her bones, bone marrow, everything, and bearing the soul out, because unless you do that, your soul will not come out, you will not be able to see the soul. So therefore, she bared everything, but people unfortunately did not see this, and that's that reflects the sad state of affairs we live in. This is her classic response to her critics. Before we end her discussion, of course, there is an argument that Kamala Das is, her poetry can best be read as, confessional poetry. It's true, of course, confession, the very word confession has a kind of a religious overtones there, but of course, here it is not religious as such. Of course, like what you do in a confession, you go and bare yourself to the priest or anybody who is listening to you. Therefore, the purpose behind it is not just psychological. Of course, psychologically it's true that when you try to bare yourself, when you try to share your inner feelings, that's also one of the important things that we need to learn in life, right? When we start sharing our problems, we feel our burden is being lifted off. That's the beauty of sharing. When you share with others your pains, you feel relieved, and when you share your joys with others, your joys are doubled. Your pain is halved and your joys are doubled. That's the beauty of sharing. Therefore, please share. Confession has that tone. That's why she went on sharing. She did not find probably or she found the pages, words as a better space to confess. Therefore, she went on confessing. Words for her was, words were for her priests or places of confession. She went on doing that. So she can be read as a confessional poet. In fact, to quickly recall what confessional poetry is, it was a term that was first coined in 1959, Rosenthal, with a particular context. Confessional mode of poetry is it's beyond the customary bounds of reticence. There is no holding back, there is no reticence here, or just because it's embarrassing for you, you don't hold back those details that are that embarrass you. No, in fact, you go beyond that, and whether it embarrasses, whether it causes discomfort for you or to the society, you go on and bear everything out. So that's the philosophy behind confessional poetry, right? Confessional poems focus therefore on the interior monologues, the monologues that happen within us, soliloquies, or when you start speaking with yourself, those kind of thoughts. Therefore, traumas, psychological issues such as mental illness, sexual problems, all the suppressed feelings, suicidal thoughts, dark and complex problems that are considered a taboo for discussion. There is nothing that is not touched in confessional poetry. Of course, in that sense, you can't find a better confessional poet than Kamala Das. As I said, for her, words were a space. Words offered her a kind of a literary space through which she chose to be honest to the core. Let's continue discussing her poetry and maybe the poetry of her fellow poet, in the next class. But so far, before we conclude, please think of significance of poetry, significance of confessional poetry, why Kamala Das is important, how she causes discomfort through her bold treatment of the subjects that were considered taboo, how she exposes hypocrisy on the one hand and finds some kind of solace in the words. Keep all these things, and we come back in the next class and continue discussing her poetry. Thank you.